Hey, Javed. Thanks for joining us on our very first Formwork Labs podcast. Where are you calling in from?
I'm just calling in from Oakland, California.
Very nice. Different from where you started your journey at Fieldwire.
We weren't too far away. I mean, we were in downtown San Francisco. I just work from home a lot more often these days.
That's fair. For those in the audience who don't know, can you give us a quick, short, kind of one-liner on what is Fieldwire?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, I'm the co-founder of FieldWire. FieldWire is a job site management solution. So, thinking field and project management feature functionality. We were a company that had about $40 million in venture capital raised. We exited to Hilti about 3 years ago for north of $300 million. And yeah, we've just consistently been building more software with Hilti since then.
Nice. Yeah, and I know that even before I joined Brick and Mortar, you guys were one of the first and kind of few construction tech startups based in Silicon Valley, raising venture dollars. I kind of group you guys into, one of the OGs. So, having that OG name, I'm sure you have a lot of things that you could share with us on things that you've learned. And I know that, even in the last, actually you're the entire time that you guys have been around, we've brought you in to help, talk a lot about the things that you've learned and to help kind of impart some of that wisdom to other people that are looking to start construction tech companies or kind of sell to the space. Um, so yeah, I guess maybe just like coming in at a high level first, if there's one key kind of, tip or trick or one piece of knowledge that you would want to impart on someone wanting to build something for the construction industry, what would that be?
Well, first off, thanks for calling me old. So that was nice. What advice would I have? I mean, honestly, just jump in and do it, right? I think a lot of people have hesitancy that they don't have a perfect solution or don't understand, all the intricacies of how they'll go to market. Just start working on it, start talking to some folks in the industry, get your product in people's hands, and just iterate. I think too many people get into analysis paralysis. Just jump. You don't know where you're going to land, but just do it. That's honestly
Yeah.
the best thing I can suggest for people.
And that's actually a really good point because I know you guys jumped in and did it, but at the early days of Fieldwire, I know you guys had, one idea that you guys were going after, but I'm not saying you guys pivoted, but you guys have then, expanded beyond that and almost, the company in some sense started to look a little bit different, kind of as you were talking to customers and figuring things out on what to build. So I call this kind of like the necessary evils, especially in construction and construction software, where, in order for a customer to use a tool, you almost have to have like somewhat of a suite of a couple of different items or a couple of different features before they can kind of come jump on board. So, how did you guys kind of figure that out? Was it just, you know, did you guys do, a ton of data analysis or was it really just, talking to all the different customers? Yeah, maybe talk a little bit on, what were some of those things that you guys really felt like you had to build to be able to kind of start selling to construction?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'll give my co-founder credit for the idea. He was the civil engineer on the team and kind of recognized the problem that FieldWire set out to solve. And so we got pretty lucky with our initial position. We really never had to kind of pivot from there, which was building a field management solution, specifically using kind of task management as the core differentiator. And so when we came out, some of the even more OG solutions out there in the market were all very document centric. And that's great. Documents are, important to help you do your work. Obviously, from a compliance standpoint, they're necessary. But what we saw when we are looking at the industry is it still had massive inefficiency issues, difficulty collaborating across the 30 companies you'd see on a project. And that's what we were setting out to solve, which is like, how do you help a team be more agile? And, interestingly, we came from the gaming world, is where I met my co-founder, and we were dependent on software like Jira to run our project and engineering teams, or product engineering teams. And so we said, why is there just not another solution like this in construction? And so the whole concept was really Jira on mobile and using a drawing as the element of structure. And to your point, what was pretty interesting is we got a lot of really good feedback around, okay, we understand what you're doing differently around tasks. We really like this, especially for especially contractors themselves. But we didn't have a lot on the document side, as you kind of mentioned. We were a little thin. We had static drawings, but we didn't have version control. We didn't have markups. We didn't have the ability to do any like basic takeoffs. And so we got to a point where we would get little clusters of customers within companies, but we couldn't basically dislodge any of the incumbents unless we built those kind of necessary evils, as you said. We always think of it as kind of offensive and defensive products or features. So offensive is how you continue to differentiate your own. Defensive is how do you basically undercut someone else's. And so we're constantly thinking about our roadmap with, what do we need to do that someone else has because it's going to be important for that initial adoption or greater kind of penetration within the account. And what can we do that others can't? And that was essentially what happened. Is we did the first year purely on task management and kind of got to a point saying, ooh, we really need these other solutions if we're going to become a bigger product. And that was kind of almost a full year of development around everything around plans, files, version control was all what we ended up spending a lot of time on. And that was what allowed us to really start gaining tremendous traction in the space. And so it was what was different about what we offered, but how do we also remove, some of the, don't know if I should be naming them, incumbent solutions that people were typically had been dependent on that had that gap that we witnessed.
Yeah. So, I mean, in addition to you guys building out, a very much needed product and a product that customers really wanted, I think Fieldwire was one of the first or the first construction tech startup to really start hiring people from the industry. So if you don't mind talking a little bit about, how did you guys, like, what was the thinking behind that, right?
Mhm.
Like hiring people from the industry and what kind of roles were they able to kind of, partake
Absolutely.
in Fieldwire?
Yeah, and I do think we were probably one of the first. It kind of came out of necessity is the mother of invention of some sorts, and so I didn't come from the industry, but I was leading our go-to-market efforts, and I really was kind of tired of looking like a total jackass in front of customers, and so I realized very early on if you paired me up with someone who had been wearing work boots around the job site, we were able to kind of connect the discussions to be a lot more richer where I'm speaking kind of hypothetically how my product would work for your workflows. But when you have an expert who has been on the job site just down the street, being able to translate that exactly to how it would work, we were just significantly more successful. And so one of our first hires was Marielle Price. She came out of Panco, local GC in SF, and she was a Stanford civil engineer. She and I just teamed up and we're like, good Lord, we are so much better than like the one and one when we kind of paired it together. And I took more of a traditional kind of sales and somewhat product based role. She took much more of a pure customer success model to it. And so we put them together and we just had tremendous success. And I think it came from that credibility, but also it allowed us to collect feedback more effectively too, because she could kind of hear things that I wasn't fully understanding. And then we could sit down with the product team and say, hey, this is where someone's really grinding, or this is what people are suggesting to do. And so that was just a natural, obvious win. But the reality, I think, we kind of got lucky falling into this a little bit. Was there was just my own need to do this, I would say, to just shore up my skill set. But the other is, it was probably one of the few areas we've really found an arbitrage. And as a startup, you're always searching for something, right? We could find talent in construction that we couldn't afford in Silicon Valley. And so you get natural builders coming out of construction companies. They know how to build product, they know these workflows. And let's be honest, sometimes having to show up at a job site at 5 a.m. and use a porta potty in the winter is not the most exciting, right? And so, we gave people a good opportunity. If you wanted to work on, 10,000 projects instead of one project, come on over to tech. And so I think it was a natural position for us to offer people a great avenue to get into tech. We were able to find better talent than we ever could for that price. And those folks came on board traditionally into customer success roles initially, but they've moved into a lot of our product team. Actually, all comes from construction, which came typically through our customer success team, probably about half of them. They also took roles in our marketing operations teams. And so it became just a feeder pool where we could build a phenomenal bench because you're looking at people that they have grit because they've been in construction. They're natural builders. They wanted to obviously change the world of construction anyways when they got into it. And so yeah, we just found phenomenal talent, and we just made that a huge portion of kind of our hiring process even to this day.
And what did that ideal kind of customer look like? Or if I'm looking at hiring from the industry and I'm a startup, is there a specific level of experience they have? Because I've heard at that
Good
five
question.
to year, like they get priced out at a certain point if they get to a senior project. So at what point do you start really going, this is the
Okay,
person who's ready to transition?
good point. We were probably looking for people right around 2 to 4 years of experience, is what I would say. Less than one is a little short. Over five, to your point, we are getting a little priced out. Plus, it's the same reason I don't recruit from Oracle, I'll be honest, or there's a lot of companies in the Valley. If you've been at Oracle for 5 plus years, we are not going to be the right company for you, right? It's just a different culture, different way of working. Doesn't mean anybody's a bad person, but yes, there's different phases where you can find people in the right talent, either for the price or because they've gotten fed up with pushing paper around on a job site and they're like, why can't we just remove this? And you're like, you are the exact person we want to chat with. And so, yeah, we were looking for project engineers, field engineers, assistant PMs. That was essentially the kind of sweet spot for us.
And are you finding them from your clients or where are you meeting these people? Because they are difficult to access and find.
So we really tried to never ever hire from a client.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah.
That was going to end well. That said, we have hired a couple from customers, not because we ever poached them, just because they applied. And these are people that were working in a multi-billion-dollar general contractor, right? At some point in time, we're talking about thousands of people moving around. They wanted to get into tech. There's a handful of us, and so I would have to have very uncomfortable conversations with our customer and be like, "Hey, someone's applying. If it makes you happier if we hire them, I can put them on your account, right?" And so at least now you have someone who kind of bridges both worlds well. And so I would try to take the sting off it where I could. And again, we didn't poach. This was purely inbound. But at the time, I think we were using AngelList up front. It's just, again, after you're out there a little bit and you've worked with these companies, your name gets out there and you just constantly get an influx of it. At least in North America. Europe is still actually quite difficult to hire for this profile, partly because the startup scene is smaller, and just taking risk is to do a startup is just not as prevalent. And so we've had more difficulty though trying to replicate this model in Europe. We're still doing it, but it is significantly harder in terms of we have to talk to like way more candidates, like 10 times as many candidates, to find the same level of talent than we would in North America.
Would you say, I guess because you brought up Europe, is scaling overseas a lot harder than what a lot of people initially assume? Because we've seen, like all the big guys are trying to do it, right? Autodesk, Procore. We've heard of, certain places successful, certain places not. Kind of curious now that, you've mentioned it. Is it a lot harder than it sounds?
So yes and no. We kind of got lucky. My co-founder being French, surprise, surprise, we ended up with a good foothold in France. And it's partly the story you can tell, right? He's helping also, bridge that gap between Silicon Valley and Europe. And so he speaks French. French sometimes like to work with French, unsurprisingly. And so it worked really well for us. And again, back to arbitrage, we thought we could find phenomenal talent in France, where people wanted to get into tech, but they didn't want to move here. And so that's where we started off. I would say it really, where it starts to matter, and why I say it depends, is what is the business model? For us, we are trying to help drive efficiency, but software is costly. And so the markets we're predominantly in are markets where salaries are high. And so because we're giving you back an hour a day, you care about that when you're getting paid $50, $100 an hour. This becomes really important. But we struggle in more developing markets sometimes because people will throw people at a problem more than they will want to employ software, because an iPad costs someone's annual salary. Well, you might just use people longer, right? And so we haven't gone global exceedingly well. Obviously, North America and Europe, we do work in pretty much, we have paying customers in over 100 countries, but the majority is in markets, again, where salaries are higher. The other thing is, we started with a bottom-up model. So we did digital distribution, and that allowed us to get in all these countries much more naturally because someone was actively looking for this solution. And so we found people all over the place because they found us. And so that's essentially how we went global. Where the difficulties pop up are market conditions are very different beyond just salaries. Germany has tons of small 50-person contracting companies. And so it changes, your unit economics, what type of outreach you can do, things like that. Obviously, there's cultural components to it. And so, like I kind of mentioned, we did great in France. I had a French co-founder that helped. We did good in some of the Nordic countries, but we struggled sometimes in other countries when you didn't have people that were kind of from that area specifically, that spoke the language, understood it. Workflows are different in Europe as well, and I think that's where you've seen some of the larger folks run into challenges. As people are typically, some of those larger folks are ERPs and PM solutions, and there's totally different workflows. Like some of the ways that we do things with RFIs and change orders just do not happen the same way in Europe, right? From a construction standpoint. And so some features that folks predominantly sell are just not valuable. And so those are the things I think you have to start considering is, how is the work done? What is the price point? What is your value prop? How do you distribute? All those things kind of go into how you want to look at going broad or not.
And then when you are going broad to a new market, what is that first step? Because you've identified that each market is different in the way that it operates and you don't have that local knowledge or expertise. So who do you talk to? How do you start?
Yeah, local talent, hire local talent is basically it. So we went back to that similar model again. We hired folks in the construction industry with 2-3 years of experience. We would bring them to the US, have them work with us for a couple of months, understand how we operated, and then kind of go back to their home market and try to set up the exact same motions. Obviously, that's why we wanted them to learn with us, is they are going to have to iterate on certain components of it, but at least they understood what the core recipe was and they can adjust it for, what their local conditions were. But that was our model of, we brought people over for a couple of months once we identified some good talent, got them in a good spot, and then, set up that entity. I think that's the other thing people need to understand is if you're going to have folks set up internationally, it makes things super complex from a tax standpoint and benefit standpoint and IP ownership management. And so it's not the best to go international until you really want to go international, because it is like setting up an entire second company almost operationally. To hire one person in a country, that's a lot of work. So you try to see how far you can push that remotely until you need it.
And what did you mean by a bottom-up distribution strategy?
Yeah, so when we started, 12 years ago now, we realized a couple things. One, almost all software had been historically purchased by like a CIO and pushed down into the company. And as a startup, and we're trying to follow kind of SaaS best practices, we looked at other solutions like, more modern Slack now, but Dropbox previous. They didn't really try to sell to begin with top down. They really tried to just infect kind of the core users, if you will, get to a critical mass and then flip it into an enterprise agreement. No one in their right mind should use a startup, right? Like, let's be real. If you're in a construction company, you have a 3-year project. Startups rarely last 3 years. So you shouldn't use a startup if you're being serious about a project. And so the way you get around that, and our idea was, let's just go directly at the field user. So if the folks we're trying to add value to are also the ones that will adopt it, and then they become our biggest advocates internally, that was our method. So we used almost entirely SEM and SEO to get out there. And because we are, by definition, a collaboration platform, we do have some elements of virality. Admittedly, we're not like Facebook viral or Instagram viral. We are construction speed viral. But, as soon as you have the GC, you get all the subs, those subs go on to another project. They, introduce you to the GC. And so you will spread, but you spread at the speed of construction, which is, project timelines, right? And so it's much slower. But we've definitely seen where, enterprise agreements with one GC, the specialty subs end up paying us more than the GC did. And the GC actually had an unlimited model at the time. And so that is, again, one of the best parts of the collaborative, having a collaboration platform that you're selling in. But that was our model, which was, let's stay away from IT until we get to, let's say, 10% of the users within a company. And then it's a much easier discussion. I remember a couple accounts where we had over 80% of the users and we finally make it to the C-suite. And one of the first questions they would ask is, will our product, will people actually adopt your product? And you're like, 80% of your company is using it right now. So, just to assure you, the answer is yes. One of the reasons we did that was because, again, we were looking for as much leverage as possible. That's, another thing startups are looking for, arbitrage, but leverage, right? Which is, how do I get something as broad as possible? And paid acquisition was a great way of, you're basically, the analogy is you're just, dragging a giant you're a boat and you're just dragging a giant net behind you. Sometimes you get little minnows, that's great. Sometimes you get whales, but you can touch thousands, tens of thousands, millions of people very quickly versus trying to have one-on-one conversations and hope you just found the right person. And because it's digital, they've already proved out when they come to you that they have a need. The fact that they even are using or entertaining your product is by definition showing that there's some problem they're inherently looking to solve. And so from a sales standpoint, it's much easier because that need has already been like self-identified at that point. I think the other aspect was, I remember one of my very first conversations was with a COO of a multi-billion-dollar GC. It's an international one. And I got to him by just going through the alumni network, which is also what I suggest to founders when they start. If you don't have a great network, just go through the civil engineering department of your alums. I don't think they get a lot of calls, it seems like, because almost everybody responds to my and one of them was the COO, and he straight up told me, he's like, it doesn't matter if I want to use your product or not. If the field doesn't adopt it, like, I'm just wasting money. So he's like, don't even pitch me. Go pitch the PMs. Go pitch the supers. If they want your product, it will end up being an enterprise solution. And that was one of the most helpful random conversations I had in like day one of starting FieldWire.
Yeah. So Javed, you talked about SEO and people finding you.
Mhm.
How has that kind of changed over time? Because I'm assuming that, as there's more and more construction tech startups, I don't know if SEO works as well anymore. Just kind of curious about like how that's changed over time, especially given, some of these like strategies, are now a lot more kind of well known.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, if we were to try to found our company today, it wouldn't work. I mean, building our product at this point, there's plenty of competitors. We're just gonna have a problem. But also, go to market, it would be much more cost prohibitive. So, to exactly what you're saying, when we started, almost no one was doing paid acquisition in our market. And so this was a fairly greenfield market. We could do it incredibly cost effectively. And then, all the big names you mentioned earlier are all doing paid acquisition now. Everybody's targeting each other's names, keywords, you name it. And so it does get more expensive. There's a limited amount of people searching on Earth in a given day for it, and everybody wants to be in front of them. And so we've done enough optimizations where we've kept the cost per acquisition essentially the same, which is really surprising. And our ACV has gone up, and so we've been able to manage to do this, but it has gotten more costly. And so if we weren't increasing ACV over the last decade, I don't know if we could have been doing it quite as effectively. But yeah, that was a great opportunity 12 years ago. Now it's just the known, right? Like if you're not doing that, it's kind of bizarre. And so yes, it got more challenging, and it's not as an obvious home run. And that's on the SEM side. SEO, I don't know. I think sometimes there's so many voices in the space now. Again, there was only 5-10 of us a decade ago. Now there's so many that it's harder to do that. But I will say some folks that brick and mortar invested in, like Zlean, I mean, those guys were brilliant in how they did it. They were very good on SEO. They wrote up some of the best knowledge-based articles and became such a resource for it that I think they got the majority of their traffic and their users through just being the known experts of their topic. And so I think it can work. I think, again, it depends on what you're selling, who you're selling to, what your product is. But for us, SEO is okay, but it's not, you're never going to move the needle enough unless you really lean into it. And I think for us, we were too busy building the product. Building the company, trying to become content creating experts is not our strength. You see, we post nothing on social media because we're weirdos, I think. But you really need to lean on that if that's the direction you want to go.
Yeah. And just another reason why you're so OG, Zlean is now level set.
Oh, yes. Sorry.
No, but at the time, Braga, go ahead. I think you had a question.
Yeah, I asked the exact question that I was going to ask, which is, does product-led growth work now? Because I've seen a lot of startups, and also probably the timing of it. I've seen a lot of startups go, I want to start off and I want to start doing product-led growth. I want to start doing SEO. I want to start getting paid acquisition. But does that really make sense as an early stage, or if you're coming in Formwork Labs? Is it only really you're probably going to do at seed, or you got some kind of market traction? When do you start thinking to start,
Good question. So we didn't do really any of that until we had some seed funding. You can do fairly cost effectively. You can run ads for $5,000 a month. and you can figure out if it works. You really don't need a ton of money to do it, but you do need a decent amount of money to scale it. And again, the payback for us is somewhere in that like year and a half range. And so you're fronting all of those costs. And so if you're spending millions of dollars on it, that does not pay itself back for another year and a half. It really takes kind of a war chest to do it. And so we were tinkering with it pre-seed, but we really didn't lean into it until we had raised money to go behind it. And I mean, we did purely product-led growth as a company. PLG wasn't even an acronym when we started. That was just the only thing we kind of knew. And so, yeah, a lot of our luck was almost based on necessity because it was what we knew from gaming, what we knew from like how we built product. And so we just applied that and it thankfully worked really well. But again, we went after the field. And so it was doable to go directly after the end users. I was talking to another company actually earlier today and they're trying to sell to the office. And I was like, you can't copy our model. Like it does not work. Like your end users in the office. So are you driving value for that user or are you driving value for the field? Because like you got to make a choice in terms of, you know, what you build, who you add value to and how you go to market all have to align. And if one of them is off, it just becomes quite problematic.
Yeah. And I feel like, thank you for that little nugget because this is what I tell like, you know, a lot of founders and also plug for why they should consider Formwork Labs. You know, your typical B2B SaaS marketing tactics that everything, you know, you read online is not going to work for construction. I mean, it may work for a small subsector of customer types that, you know, are similar, you know, but for the most part, a lot of people in construction are not big on LinkedIn, you know, especially if you're targeting the field or the workers, like they're just phone numbers. And like, you kind of need to know a guy to get to the guy.
you want to find as many things that can work and you want to do fast experiments. And so we didn't love doing ads on LinkedIn because they had a minimum $2 bid cost, which becomes difficult when you go through the entire, you know, conversion funnel of do they click the ad? Do they go to your website? Do they sign up? Do they become paying? Yada, yada, yada. You know, the percentages keep getting smaller, which makes that cost a little prohibitive. But we did do other things on LinkedIn, which hopefully doesn't get me banned, but we totally created scrapers and things, right? So we don't do it anymore on LinkedIn if anyone ever tunes in from the group here. But we would actively put in specific keywords and just look at people's pages all day, every day, thousands of times. I think they turned it down so that we could only do 750 at one point because they realized people were doing this. And we weren't scraping, but we just look at it. And again, every single day, about 15 people would reach out to me because they would say, oh, that's cool. I didn't realize you know, you're looking at my profile. I like what you guys are doing. You're like, maybe we should chat. And so this is one of those things that we spent like an hour or two. We wrote a script. We just gave this login info to my co-founder and myself. We gave him the credentials for the script. This thing all day, every day went and looked at a couple thousand people, created a couple conversations, created some accounts, get some feedback, great stuff. And so you're always looking for something to be able to, again, just get leverage. One afternoon activity led to, I don't forget how much money. One Twitter ad got me $1 million account. So like, but we never really got probably another dollar out of Twitter, if I'm being honest. But hey, that first 50-cent ad converted really well. The problem on Twitter was the pool of users is tiny that by the end of like 2 weeks, they keep seeing the same ads, right? And so back to Alice's point, early adopters from construction, if you were on Twitter is great. Like you are an early adopter if you're there, but there wasn't that many of them. And so you kind of constantly have to keep looking at new channels, right? You test a channel, you see how well it works, you test the elasticity, how far can you go? It starts getting competitive or you start running out, you move on to the next one. We've had some that have lasted forever, which is our paid acquisition model. But we have tested some others. And so that's, you know, Google carrying the way. Bing isn't actually so bad. But a lot of other things we tested like Twitter and just never really went back to.
So I was one of those engineers. When I was at DPR, I was a young engineer and I think it was Eves, had viewed my profile. And at the time, like no one, who the hell would view a, you know, construction engineer's profile, right? It's like, you know, we're just doing our stuff, you know, building buildings. And it's like, oh, like, why is this person viewing my profile? And then you click on it and then you're like, oh, FieldWire. Oh, wait, we're using CMYC. We're using these tools, blah, blah, blah. So I definitely totally fell for it. And I am pretty sure it works because
my recruiting
nowadays, like,
My recruiting team for years sent emails. I mean, I gave them my LinkedIn as well. And humorously, they messaged what became our VP of Ops for a while. He worked for my wife. And so, like, it was the most obvious thing to him to get this email from me, aka my recruiting team, through my LinkedIn profile. And he's like, "What the hell is this?" He's like, I know your wife. Like, we work together. Like, why wouldn't you just reach out through her?" And he's like, "Obviously, this is your recruiting team." But hey, we hired him. It was fantastic. So it still worked again. But yeah, pretty funny stuff that you try. Um, Reflecting back actually on one of your first questions, and I feel like I maybe gave too flippant of an answer when you said, "What should you do to start?" And I said, "Just jump in." We actually had a better framework for that. Uh, we decided to set money aside for a minimum of 6 months. So we saved up, I think, like $20,000. Went on a full like ramen ham sandwich diet and said, "Look, 6 months, we're dedicating this thing, and we want to see at least one of these three things for us to continue forward." It was get into a top accelerator, figure out how to hire people with or without money we didn't know, and then fundraise. And if we could do at least one of those things, we would continue forward for like at least another 6 months. Thankfully, because we had been working on the product literally for over a year, nights and weekends, we got accepted to accelerator in our first week, and then we ended up fundraising within 6 months as well, coming out of that accelerator. And so, giving you also a shout out, yes, Formwork Labs. It's a great way to help ease your way into startup in the startup scene. But even extending beyond that, something that you said, which is true, is there was a tremendous advantage to having you and the brick and mortar team on the board, because I think if you only have traditional SaaS investors, and they're great for what they do, they don't know construction as well, and they typically like to try to apply similar frameworks and playbooks. And construction just chews up and spits out a lot of those things. If you try to just apply a traditional SaaS model on things, um, construction operates differently. It doesn't necessarily work. Some things do, and it's good to always experiment and try different stuff. But you need to be smart enough to realize that it's unique enough and has its own problems. And I remember Darren at one point in time was saying, he's like, "Look, half of winning in construction is just existence. Like, if you're just around long enough time, you build up the past performance, you build up the credibility, and you can just, it's like a snowball effect." But that's hard for startups sometimes because you just see the hockey stick and you want to go as fast as possible. But I think managing that risk and how you spend and how you try to, extend the y-axis in your existence, or I guess the x-axis in this case, that's, I think, important. And so having people like, Darren and the brick and mortar team on board was super helpful because they were able to also translate and make arguments to our own board for us sometimes, which was great to be like, "We could try that, but I think this is what's going to happen." And you're like, "Thank you for saving me this discussion and like me experimenting for like $200,000 on something I didn't want to do." And so, yeah, having people that are at that cross section of SaaS and construction is super valuable on your board. Yeah, I think brick and mortar is arguably one of the most valuable investor board member we had, mainly because they could connect the venture capital world with strategics and what's going on in construction. And that was why we built the board the way that we did. Is we had some traditional VC side with obviously folks like Menlo, Bloomberg Beta in there. Formation 8, which no longer exists, but Jim Kim. But then we also had Darren Bechtel, obviously from Brick and Mortar, and then we had folks like Hilti. And again, sometimes strategics can like get a bad name, and I guess they sometimes deserve that. Hilti is not one of them, but Hilti did a great job of investing. We partnered with them, and we were able to de-risk working with them to the point that joining them through the acquisition made a lot of sense. But I think Darren did a good job again of being able to translate from like Hilti to traditional VC on our own board sometimes, which was great.